All right. I think I'm live. YouTube says I'm live, and there's 4 people already. That's awesome. Facebook says I'm live. Sounds good. I guess we're ready to roll. So it's 12:59. See, I'm early. Say hi if you're on, and if you're watching. It'd be good to know who I'm talking to today, but otherwise, I'll just ramble towards the internet at large. I got my coffee going. It's a Monday. Gotta love Mondays. This is the 3rd cup of coffee today because I'm not used to Mondays. I'm not used to getting out of bed and engaging with church stuff, but this is a good time to do this, and it's a good chance for me to spend a little more time with the staff. If I have Mondays off and everyone else has Fridays off, we don't really see each other that much. So anyway, we're going to experiment with this Monday idea and as much coffee as I can drink. So welcome everybody who's watching. Today is the last day of November. We're going to be talking about yesterday's sermon on Thanksgiving. Why Thanksgiving matters is the idea. It was a holiday weekend and also the first week of Advent, so it was a good chance to hit the pause button on the Luke series, which we'll pick up again in January. This gives us a couple weeks now between now and Christmas Eve to talk about Advent stuff and Thanksgiving stuff and all that kind of fun action. So yesterday, hi Marthan, good to see you. Yesterday was Thanksgiving, and last week in the Monday Breakdown, I said that I may do the 10 lepers story about Thanksgiving, where Jesus heals 10 lepers, but only one comes back and says thank you. But then I realized that's actually in Luke. That's in Luke 17. It's not in Matthew or Mark. And I thought, well, I am going to hopefully be doing that passage here in a couple months. And I thought I don't really want to do it twice necessarily or pull it out of its context when we run into it coming up. So that's why I shifted gears. And I was thinking of, I want to still do a story. I want to do a narrative for Thanksgiving. I didn't really want to do just something maybe from one of Paul's letters that's more about theology. I wanted to do something that had a story behind it for Thanksgiving. And I work on, I don't know if some of you guys know this, but it's worth passing along. In the evenings after dinner, I often will work on helping my good friend Matt Whitman with his daily podcast. He has a daily podcast called the 10-Minute Bible Hour. He came out to Grace, I don't know, about a year and a half ago and visited us and filmed us and interviewed me for his YouTube channel. Well, he also has a daily audio podcast where he's going through the book of Matthew verse by verse. And I get to kind of proof it to make sure he doesn't have any theological errors on it. In fact, my phone's ringing right now, and it's him calling, but he can wait. So, hi, Dad, Rich, Catherine. Thanks for checking in. Good to see you guys. Anyway, so I help him with his podcast as he's going through the Gospel of Matthew, and it's remarkable how much the stories that he's going through, as just verse by verse through Matthew, mirror what we're doing in Luke. Some things aren't quite the same order, but I feel like I'm getting to study in depth 2 different Gospels during this time. I also get to do some music for his podcast, which is always fun. But anyway, he had taken the week of Thanksgiving off. And what he had sent me to produce for him was an old sermon he did when he was doing a series on the covenants. The Abrahamic covenant, the Mosaic covenant, the David covenant, the new covenant. And so I had been spending some time in the evenings last week going through his message about the Mosaic covenant and how people had responded in the whole story of the golden calf. And that narrative, that story just kind of, I thought, wow, even though it doesn't say anything specific about Thanksgiving, that is a really good story about how we process the works of God and then forget the works of God, and then how we can be led into idolatry because of our forgetfulness and our sinfulness. But then I also thought what I really wanted to preach for Thanksgiving was to be thankful for the gospel. That was the big swath that I really wanted to get out there. And so, yeah, I did borrow from my friend's podcast, as the idea to go to Exodus 19 and 32 as kind of the narrative structure to talk about Thanksgiving, as well as to talk about the old covenant of the Mosaic law versus the new covenant that we have in the blood of Christ. And I don't know how well all of it held together. I got some good feedback yesterday, and I'm not necessarily here just trying to beg for good feedback, but I was trying to attempt to put a really fun story along with the theology of the covenants and why the gospel is better than the law, or is the fulfillment of the law, and gives us the freedom from having to be 100% at keeping the law, which nobody can do but Christ. And so I had that whole theological chunk, but then also be thankful for the gospel at the end. And I hope it held together. I kind of felt like that was a pretty big chunk for one sermon, but why not? And I think Thanksgiving was the connective tissue to that, or at least I tried to make it that. So anyway, that's kind of the backstory and how that came about. I wanted to do the 10 lepers, but I ended up doing that narrative because I was reminded of it in the work I was doing on the podcast, and then I mixed the covenant idea with the gospel idea and tried to hold it all together with Thanksgiving. And now you know the backstory on that. Hey, Hal and Cynthia and Jacob, good to see you guys as well. So does anybody have any comments or questions that can kind of get us started before I just kind of keep rambling? I want to be able to answer and speak to what's on your mind, since you are taking time out of your Monday as well to look at this beautiful face made for radio. Yeah. Oh, by the way, the opening illustration of being a paperboy in 7th grade is 100% true. It's 100%, not that I would, I mean, sometimes I exaggerate for the purposes of impact in a sermon, but that one, I had that paper route job. I think I did it less than half the time. I think my dad did it more than half the time. I did get fired from it eventually because I did not keep up my end of the covenant that I made with the Daily Herald employers that I had. So I have a lot of fun stories about that paper route. But the point being that the gospel is God's way of fulfilling the covenant because we can't, in the same way my dad fulfilled my covenant with the Daily Herald. And so since you're watching, Dad, if you have more to say about that, that is always a story that I knew would be a good illustration about the gospel. And I finally had a chance to do that. So, and maybe you could even speak to, Dad, whether or not that was your intent at the time, was to teach me a theological lesson about the gospel, or if you were just frustrated with me because I wouldn't roll out of bed that early. There we go. Great question, Catherine. How do you understand God seeming to change his mind or allow the perspective of a person to change his behavior? I'm assuming you're talking about when he told Moses, step aside, I'm going to wipe them all out. And Moses implores him and says, please don't do that. And God relents because of Moses's plea, which I think there's something to that jumped out at me this time studying that, because when God said that to Moses, he knew what was going on at the base of the mountain. And we, the readers, knew what was going on at the base of the mountain, but Moses didn't. And so God says, I'm going to wipe them all out. And Moses says, please don't. What will the nation say? It'll make Egypt look like the winners in all this. And that's a bad idea. But then when Moses gets down to the foot of the mountain, he's just as angry as God was earlier, I think. And the whole throw the tablets down and make the people drink the melted down powdered idol. So I'm curious, as I read that this time, that's a question I might want to find out someday, is had Moses known what the people were doing, when God knew what the people were doing, would he have tried to talk God out of it? But back to the original question. Oh, thank you, Dad. I also spent a lot of energy trying to wake you up in those days, says my dad. That I'm sure you did. But the question at hand is, if God knows everything and God is sovereign, can anyone actually change his mind? I don't think the text in this particular instance is trying to tell us a theological position on God's sovereignty. I think the text is trying to tell us the emotions of God when he sees his people sinning. And I think it tells us about his character, that he is A, holy, and B, responsive to his people. Now, does that take away from the fact that he knew it would happen and maybe he knew Moses would talk him out of it? Or maybe it's just presented as, since Moses is the one that wrote this, from Moses' perspective of, yeah, we had this conversation and I think I talked him out of it. But from God's perspective, it was like, no, obviously I wasn't going to do that, Moses, but thank you for recording that conversation. And through the Holy Spirit, he wanted us to know that conversation. I think it's, we need to let the text be what the text is. Say that the text says what the text says. And what the text is saying there is the friction between God and the people he just let out of Egypt. And that he has an emotional reaction to their lack of faith and thanksgiving. And I think that is really it sets the pace for the entire Old Testament. I mean, this pattern of God delivers his people and his people forget, and then they run to other gods or other nations. And so God brings up calamity against them so that they will return to him. And I think that pattern is definitely true. And in God's foreknowledge that he knew that pattern would happen and eventually lead all the way to Christ, I think is absolutely the case. And I referenced Romans 3 in the sermon. If you go back to the end of Romans 3 there, 23 and following, it says, not only for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, but are justified freely as a gift by his grace. But it also talks about that God, in his forbearance, had allowed previous sins to go unpunished, knowing that they would all finally be punished on Christ. And so I think even in that moment where he's having the conversation with Moses and Moses is saying, well, what will the other nations say? I'm pretty confident in that moment God also knew in the back of his mind that the end goal of this is to visit all of those sins on his representative, on his son, for the new covenant, for all the sins of those who couldn't keep the old covenant. And that's a lot of what Romans 1, 2, and 3 is about. So can we change God's mind if we plea and implore him hard enough? I don't know. I don't think so. I do believe in his sovereignty and his full foreknowledge. But at the same time, he commands us to pray. And he commands us to pray like the widow who didn't get justice from the judge in the parable, that we should pray and not give up. And then he demonstrated praying to the Father. Jesus did when he was on earth. So that is one of those $1,000,000 theological questions. Why pray if God's sovereignty is going to make sure that everything happens exactly as he wants it? And the answer is because he told us to. Because he is an engaging, relational God, not simply a dictator and dominator where everything happens the way he says so and we have no say in it. He still allows us and invites us to have a say in it. And only maybe when we get to the new earth will we truly understand how those two things coexist. But I think to say, well, let's not make pleas on behalf of people because God's already got it figured out, it's going to go his way, I'm not sure that that's what any of the text says or implies. So all that to say, I think it's a both and, not an either or. He did promise never to wipe out all of the people on earth again after the flood. So the conversation in Exodus 32 would have just been his own people. And he was going to start over with Moses and create a people again. So he wouldn't be violating his promise to Abraham in doing that. But I do think it's interesting that Moses' reply that convinces God is about the uniqueness of God's relationship with Israel, as opposed to the other nations' relationships with their gods, which is the heart behind the law and the heart behind the Mosaic covenant. Is this is a unique relationship that God has with this specific people at this specific point in history. I think one of the major mistakes that we make in biblical interpretation is when we think that covenant is with God and anyone who ever falls under the category of his people. That was a Mosaic covenant for the children of Israel he led out of Egypt, and it's not the United States. So a lot of times we'll pull verses out of context that were unique to God and that nation among the nations of the time, and we say, oh, this is for all time in some sort of political and historical vacuum, and I can just apply it to me as an American. And we got to be real careful with that. There is a uniqueness there, and Moses appealed to that uniqueness in as the passage says, getting God to relent. So those are just some other things we need to keep in mind. Yeah, don't get me started on how Old Testament Israel is not the United States, because that'll fill the whole half hour that we've got. And we're already 15 minutes in, and I've answered one question. So does anybody else have anything they might want to share or ask? One of the things I'll just talk about as a preacher and a sermon writer that I always struggle with is putting words into other people's mouths. In other words, I made this list in this message of what idols do we run to. So ancient Israel, they ran to this golden calf, which, again, hilariously, Aaron's just like, I was surprised as anybody that a calf came out of that fire. And Moses' question is also really good. What did these people do to you that you would do this for them? But his whole I had no idea. It was a cow. Huh. Surprising. And then they would run after the idols of the Philistine gods. They would run after the idols of the Assyrian gods, or pick a nation, Amalekites, Ammonites. But a lot of times they would run to other nations. They would run to Egypt for help, or they would run to other armies. And God was usually pretty frustrated with them when they would do that as well. So anyway, I was like, okay, if we're going to talk about idols and running to idols when we're not thankful, what idols do we have? And I struggle with those lists, just so you guys know. I do it often in sermons. Okay, here are 5 examples of this that I think are true of us. But I do tend to struggle with, I don't want to put things in other people's hearts. Like, I don't know what idols you might run to. And so I go for kind of that broad stroke, and I made this list of money, entertainment, politics, security, because I think it's important to specify what it means in our day and age. But at the same time, it's kind of like, your idols are going to be your idols. And we all need to repent of our idols, and that's the gospel, so that we can enjoy the favor of God in the new covenant. But it is difficult, because I need to make that point of specificity for the listener at the same time as not knowing what's specific to you, the listener. So I guess that would be a second challenge, again, is as you make, the first challenge was make a list of things you're thankful for, but maybe another challenge is take the time to put together what you think your idols might be, so that you can recognize when your heart runs after them, because it's going to be different for different people. Sometimes it's just, I pray and say, Lord, help me to know what to put on those lists, because I don't know the hearts of people. Sometimes it's just I put down mine on those lists, and then assume or hope that other people have gone through similar things. Sometimes there's good research behind it, and I can come up with a list just because other people have done a lot of surveys and research, and then I have a work cited I can go to, a bibliography, and say, hey, this is what so-and-so says from Gallup poll exhibit X, and come up with a good list that way. So did anybody, I'll put it back to you guys, did anybody work on some of those lists? What miracles has God done for you? I have my notes here in front of me. What miracles has God done for you? How has God been leading you? Do you have particular altars you've built? Or I can even ask the real general question if you guys want to chime in on this. I got 6 people watching on Facebook and 14 on YouTube right now. So I know some of you are there and can answer this question, but I always ask my kids on a Sunday when we get home from church, did you learn anything new today? Did you learn anything new? Sometimes I learned a lot new when I'm preparing it, and even while I'm speaking it. But did you learn anything new in this passage? Did you know that Moses made people drink the cow? How about a nice tall glass of melted golden calf? Roberta, an altar is an Ebenezer. There you go. And And y'all hopefully learned some Hebrew that Eben, pronounced Evan, um, means stone in Hebrew, and Netzer means remember, memory. So yeah, an altar is an Ebenezer. Actually, there's that great hymn, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, and there's a lyric in there, Here I raise my Ebenezer. Here I raise my Ebenezer, which as a kid, and pretty much everyone nowadays is immediately going to think Ebenezer Scrooge. What a weird word to be in a song. And so even sometimes that gets updated into modern language when it's sung. Here I raise my stone of memory is, I think, one way I've heard it before. Here I raise my stone of memory. Anyway, same kind of idea. Montez, hi on Facebook. The drinking the cow surprised us. Yeah. Yeah, like I said in the message, if you've seen the Charlton Heston movie, throwing down the tablets is what people know. But the old, hey, melt that thing down, put it in powder, and treat it like Ovaltine is kind of fun. But I think there is something to that. If we chase after idols, God will make us partner with those idols and learn what happens. Miriam, thank you. My decision to be baptized as an adult was an Ebenezer for me. I think baptism for sure is an Ebenezer. I think that's what it's for, is for us to remember, hey, this is a moment I went public with this confession. My wedding ring is an Ebenezer of my relationship with my wife. Everywhere I go, I can look at it and remember, yes, I made that commitment. I made that decision. Baptism, I think, is a lot like a wedding. You're going public with that commitment in front of everybody, and you can always remember that, yes, I did that. That is a great Ebenezer. I remember one time I got to do this teaching. This was real early in my ministry. I was probably in my early 20s, but I was doing a midweek teaching at the church we were at in the Chicago suburbs. And I talked about the altar. We need to build an altar so that we can remember something significant that we can remember. God showed up in this moment. And a week later, the youth pastor came up to me and he said, hey, Jeff, I built an Ebenezer as a result. I built an altar as a result of your teaching. I'm like, great, what'd you do? And he rolled up his sleeve and he had this huge tattoo. And I said, I'm not sure that's what I was talking about, but okay. I've lost touch with that guy. I wonder if he's has any regrets of doing that 25 years ago. Yeah. I have to be careful when I say that in sermons. Like, I'm not recommending going getting inked up just because we talked about altars, but I do know a guy who that's what he did. Yeah, it's tough. Not tough. I think it's a good thing. But I constantly have this Romans connection in my head too. It seems like everything we're doing in the last few weeks, and it's because I'm teaching through Romans on Wednesdays, or at least I did up until a couple weeks ago. We're going to start that again this Wednesday night. So if you want to be a part of that, let us know, and we'll get you the Zoom link. But yeah, how Romans 1, 2, and 3 overlays with so much of what we're doing in kingdom stuff out of Luke, and certainly Old Covenant, New Covenant stuff, to talk about that this week. Catherine, good reminder to think about altars in my own life. I think of them often as signposts where I can look back when God seems silent and remember that God has moved and worked. Yeah, I think that's exactly what they're for. And again, it's the memory. It's the stone of memory. It's not just a religious significant thing. It's that this is going to help me remember. Because one of the things I learned new in the study of this passage this week was that it was the third new moon since Passover. Because the timing of the wanderings in the wilderness, the flight from Egypt, the giving of the law, the going to the promised land, the sending the spies, the rejecting Joshua and Caleb's message, which resulted in 40 years of wandering, and where they set up camp here and there in Kadesh Barnea, and eventually Joshua taking over. Like all of that, my brain, even though I've read the Pentateuch plenty of times, still struggles to know when things happen in relation to other things. And so for me to find that cue in the passage about it had been 3 months, basically. It was about 90 days. And that's how quickly they forgot. That's how quickly the Red Sea parting became a non-issue. And I think, yeah, sometimes that is true for me, that something amazing can happen, and then almost immediate, it's like, okay, what have you done for me lately? And so those altars really help. Okay, look at this. Theological student here. My dad, Jerry, says it was 3.5 months because they left Egypt at the full moon. Yeah, that makes sense. Passover is a lunar festival. And that was another thing. If I would have had more time, and maybe I'll lean into the next few times we get to share communion, is the connection of the Last Supper, where the new covenant is spoken of by Jesus, and Passover. The fact that it was a Passover meal they were sharing, the fact that he's connecting the blood of the lamb to his blood, that he connects the covenant that came as a result of leaving Egypt with the covenant that he is establishing through his death and resurrection. There's a lot of meat there. There's a lot of theological significance in the connecting of those particular dots that I'm not sure we dig into. I know I don't dig into as often as I'd like sometimes. So that was kind of a fun little passing thing in the message yesterday. Yeah, and that's why Easter follows the Passover lunar calendar, which is why it's not always on the same day every year, because it coincides with Passover. That's the goal of Easter, because he was raised on the first day of the week after the Passover celebration. Well, I got 4 minutes left, so I'm going to go last chance here on comments or questions. Just a reminder for what's coming. This Sunday, December 6th, is our district superintendent, Greg Fell, is coming. We invited him to come and speak to the membership about some of the new bylaw changes. And if he was going to be here for that, to have him preach as well. And he said what he'd like to do for the sermon is kind of a 2020 in review type of idea, and how that has affected churches and Christians. So my understanding is that's what he'll be doing. I'll still do this Monday breakdown next Monday and maybe give my perspective on it, or follow up. I can't answer questions for him, but I still think it would be good for us to do this. And then that leaves us 2 Sundays, December 13th and December 20th, leading up to Christmas. So we'll focus on some Advent things for those 2 Sundays. And then Christmas Eve, I'll let you guys know as kind of the first people to find out about this. But I've been working with the music department, particularly Carissa and Tanya, about doing a Christmas musical for an online Christmas Eve. So we're talking to all the different music groups to maybe pre-record a song that can go into almost like a Christmas music review, and I'll do a message, about 10-minute message for that video, and that will go out live. Will go out live. It's not live. It'll go out pre-recorded on Christmas Eve as kind of a special musical extravaganza for Grace Church people. But also, we will do a 6 o'clock live for whoever wants to come, that we're not going to record or put online. It'll just be sing a couple carols, light some candles, and have kind of the Christmas Eve feel together. And wherever Boulder County is on that, we're still going to find a way to meet. And we might actually meet outdoors on Christmas Eve for that, and do kind of an a cappella, sing a couple carols, pass the candles around, those types of things on Christmas Eve live, but then also have kind of more of a production available online for Christmas Eve for those who want to do it that way. So that's going to be pretty cool. And I'm excited to be doing that this Sunday, and potentially for the entire month of December, at least until things shift. And I'll talk more about this in the Thursday video update. We are allowed to have 50 people in the room with Boulder County. And so we're not going to be fully open as a church, but I think we are going to allow those 50 people to start coming in this Sunday. So if that's something that is really important to you, we're not going to turn you away. We will say, please wear the masks if you do come and are part of that 50 people. But at least at the 8:30 recording, we're going to allow for some of that. I'll give more details on that on Thursday. So hopefully this was worth your half hour of coming and covering some of these things. Time for one more question. Catherine, go ahead. Jump right in. The 1:30 is as arbitrary as anything else I do around here, so happy to answer it while we are gathered. Montez has given us some update here. I woke up in the night thinking about so many times God has shown up when we were broke, when my brother was hurt, when things seemed impossible, and how when things get hard, I always think back to those times. With the pandemic, I needed to be reminded to remember. Thank you. I agree. Catherine's question here as we wrap up, the old covenant was conditional for material blessing, but spiritual blessing unconditional, right? Think of Abraham and the fire pot creating unconditional covenant. Yeah, covenant theology is an interesting study. When God called Abraham in Genesis 12, it seemed pretty unconditional. I'm going to do this. I have picked you and I will do this. I will make of you a great nation and you will bless other nations. And then Abraham tried to make it happen on his own with the whole Hagar and Ishmael thing. And that was when God kind of stepped in, and then there became some conditions of you either trust me or you don't on this. And the Mosaic covenant is different than the Abraham covenant in that there definitely is more of the detailed blessings and curses. If you do this, I will bless you. If you do this, I will curse you. Either way, all the nations will know that I'm the one true God. David's covenant is somewhat unconditional in that there will always be a descendant of yours on the throne, and the Messiah will be the one who will reign forever. And David really he couldn't have undone that covenant. I think the new covenant, conditional it's interesting, and it depends on how we define conditional. Because there's an element of even the new covenant that's conditional on the faith of the hearer. We are judged based on our faith or lack of faith. But the covenant and the functional blessing and salvation that comes with it is entirely God's doing, 0% our doing. So it's unconditional, and yet it is dependent or given to those who believe and not given to those who don't believe. So does that make it conditional on faith? But yet it's unconditional in its blessings. I think that the point that I was trying to make yesterday is the new covenant is completely unlike the old covenant in that God himself has fulfilled every single piece of it. And it is the fulfillment of the old covenant. And the new covenant is not about works at all. It is not about keeping any sort of law. And in fact, it's certainly, if you read Galatians and Romans, it's not about adding rules after we're saved by grace. It is justification, sanctification, and glorification, all as a gift by the grace of God through the power of his Spirit. So there is definitely infinitely more amazing component to the fact that we are under the new covenant than what it would have been like to have to keep the Mosaic covenant and keep the law. And so I'll end with that. And if you want to know more about how the old covenant, new covenant connect, read the book of Hebrews. That's a really fun way to kind of get to that. So I don't know if I really answered that question, Catherine, but I think it's a really important way to think about how are we defining conditionality. At the end of the day, it really is all about Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. And so with that, I will sign off. We will see you guys hopefully Thursday for the update video, and we can see 50 of you face-to-face this Sunday. And thanks for being here. We'll do this again next week. See ya.